So now let's move on to chapter 25, New Worlds, the Americas and Oceania. When the Spanish mariners landed in the Caribbean, they met the indigenous Tainos, or Arawaks. We believe the Taino are from originally South America, and they only settled the Caribbean in the late centuries BCE from the 900 CE. Columbus uses Hispaniola, which is the island that encompasses Haiti and Dominican Republic, as a base for the trading with the Tainos. However, he is disappointed that they have no spices and silks, so he decided to quote-unquote recruit / really enslave the locals to mine the gold instead. Lovely. He begins the encomienda system, which was forced labor in exchange for protection and Christian conversion. Really, this was just an excuse to exploit the natives for cheap labor. This was basically American feudalism, with the peninsulares, or white Hispanics from the Iberian Peninsula, being given land and a specified number of native laborers. The Tainos would occasionally rebel, but they were outgunned by Spanish military technology. And they were also really decimated by smallpox epidemics beginning in 1518. Spaniards launched raids to kidnap and replace the workers that were being killed by diseases, but this only spreads the disease further. This has a catastrophic effect on the population. The native Caribbean peoples being reduced from 4 million to a few thousand by the 1540s. Their culture is almost completely obliterated, living only on words such as canoe and barbecue. The Caribbean was pretty much a near-empty backwater until the Dutch, French, and English sugar and tobacco plantations started a century later based on African slavery. The Spanish eventually conquer and explore other territories in the pursuit of God, gold, and glory. Hernan Cortez and 450 men bring down the Aztec Empire in Mexico. Thanks to their superior Spanish technology, resentment of the local indigenous peoples to Aztec life, and especially smallpox. Francisco Pizarro and 600 men do something similar, bringing down the entire Inca Empire in Peru. At first, the conquest of Mexico and Peru not the result of imperial policy, but rather the individual efforts of freelance adventurers. However, eventually the Spanish administration was based in New Spain, Mexico, and New Castile, Peru take over. Mexico City is built upon Tenochtitlan and found Lima in Peru. Viceroys appointed by the monarch in Spain are rule, but they are supervised by local courts called audiencias, designed to prevent buildup of local power bases. However, this doesn't prevent considerable disputes with Spanish homeland, and as a result, the viceroys would try to act with some degree of independence, often procrastinating in fulfilling orders, or just simply not even carrying out the orders from Madrid. In 1494, the Treaty of Tordesillas divides the entire non-Christian world between Spain and Portugal, with Portugal claiming Brazil. This was really unintentional. There was little interest at first, but increased as other imperial powers take notice. Brazil eventually exploited for sugarcane production. And so this is the Treaty of Tordesillas, as we can basically a territory which divides Spanish and Portuguese possessions. Spanish towns and forts, missions, and forts and missions are established on the east coast of North America, with some on the west coast. However, these are dislodged in the 17th century by French, English, and Dutch mariners, with the French establishing colonies in Nova Scotia and Quebec in 1604 and 1608 respectively, England with Jamestown in 1607, and the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1630. Netherlands built New Amsterdam, now New York City, in 1623. The English took it in 1664 and renaming it to New York. Now, these colonies weren't exactly a great place to live, as starvation was rampant and cannibalism was occasionally practiced. However, the French and English private merchants continued to invest heavily in the expansion of colonies, with the private investors retaining control over colonial affairs. This allowed for a greater level of self-government than Spanish and Portuguese colonies, which explains why British/French North America the United States and Canada, ended up doing so much better than Latin America, which until really recently was economic roadkill, as my AP World History teacher creatively put it. So this is a map of the various the European empires and colonies in the Americas about 1700. We have the French, we have the British taking most of Canada, the French in Louisiana. The British also have some possessions along the east coast, with Spain taking large chunks of modern day Latin America. With New Spain here, New Granada, Rio de la Plata. Brazil, as we can see, is occupied by the Portuguese. The North American peoples were loosely organized and mostly migratory, unlike the Aztec and Incan empires. European colonists would stake up forested land and clear for rare brand of agriculture. This, as you might imagine, really pisses off the natives. There's an increasing number of Europeans arriving seeking ample land, with 150,000 from England in the 17th century. This would unsurprisingly lead to conflicts. Colonists displaced the indigenous peoples and trespass on the hunting grounds. English settlers negotiate treaties as a way to justify seizing land. However, these treaties were poorly understood by the natives. Military conflict was frequent, and the natives were also devastated by epidemic diseases. All this contribute to a massive population decrease from 5 to 10 million to 600,000. So this is a map of North American populations. As we can see, originally there was a lot of native. Unfortunately, there was originally a lot of native, but then there's plummets due to disease, and the European African populations rise due to immigration and slavery. European and African migrants were primarily men, in Latin America, European and African migrants were primarily men. Therefore, there were frequent relationships with native women. You had the creation of mestizo or mixed societies forming, who are basically people of Spanish and native parentage. Descendants of Spaniards and African slaves were called mulattoes. Now, we really don't use this term anymore because of its offensive history, so don't go around calling half-black, half-white people mulattoes. Just please don't. Descendants of African slaves and natives were called zambos. In Latin America, you had this incredibly really rigid race-based hierarchy. At the top were the peninsulares, i.e. migrants from the Iberian Peninsula who lived in the Americas but were born in Iberia. The Creoles, i.e. children of migrants born in Western Hemisphere, not Eastern, below them, and these Creoles are below the peninsulares. And at the bottom below them are the mestizos, mulattoes, zambos, and other combinations of parentage. And at the bottom you have the slaves and conquered peoples. Unfortunately, the establishment of this really rigid racial hierarchy would explain many of Latin America's social problems later on. Even to this day, power and wealth is still heavily concentrated in the hands of the Hispanic white population, which also explains why many politicians in countries that are heavily not white, like Mexico, which is heavily mestizo, tend to be Hispanic white. Let me rephrase that. This explains why many countries that are not really very Hispanic white, like Mexico, almost always will have Hispanic white presidents. Now, in North America, you had a higher ratio of French and especially English female migrants than in South America because they actually decided to bring women along with them. However, you still had some white native relations, especially in France, where fur traders weren't numerous enough to have partners. Real children were called métis. However, the English strongly discouraged relationships between individuals of different ancestry, and it refused to accept offspring of mixed parentage. Basically, this was virulent racism. Spaniards hunt for gold and silver. The conquistadores loot Aztec, Inca treasures and melt them down for their value as raw precious materials. Gold is not extensive in these Spanish holdings, but silver is relatively plentiful. They conscript natives extensively, with the Incan mita system being of conscripted labor adopted for this purpose. These natives are often forced to work in terrible working conditions. 1/5 of the money reserved for the crown, and this is hugely profitable. This silver is a major resource of income for the Spanish crown. The Spanish silver is eventually circulated for European and eventually Asian markets, with Manila Galleons take it to the Pacific Rim directly for trading. Most American silver makes its way to China. And this also stimulated the world economy, like by having a bigger money supply. However, this bigger money supply would eventually backfire badly on Spain because due to the glut of extra silver, inflation skyrockets out of control and Spain begins its period of decline. So this is a map of the galleon trade. As we can see, the galleons leave, ever leave Manila or Acapulco, New Spain, and just go head the other way. The Hacienda was an agricultural system that dominated Spanish colonies. These were large estates that produced products of European origin, such as wheat, grapes, and meat. The economy and the system of utilizing labor force provides the labor. However, there is rampant, and however, unsurprisingly, there is rampant abuses from 1520 to 1540. The Hacienda system also explains also is another reason why there is great inequality, along with the racial hierarchy, in Latin American societies to this day. This economy is gradually replaced by debt peonage, where peasants were paying loans with cheap labor. So this is a picture of a hacienda in Chile. Oh, excuse me. So now I know this is kind of scary, but this is basically just explaining a system of reservations with the Spanish setting aside land, setting aside land for indigenous people to rule over themselves. Now, the indigenous population did not go down with a fight. They would launch rebellion. They would often launch rebellions, such as the Pueblo Revolt in 1680 and the Tupac Amaru Rebellion in 1780. They would also sometimes just do only half-hearted work or retreat into mountains and forests. They also try to make appeal to the Spanish crown. In Portuguese Brazil, you had an extensive sugar manufacturing business, with the sugar mill or engenho referring to the complex of land, labor, and etc., all related to the production of sugar in one place. Sugarcane will be processed to molasses or refined to sugar for export, because sugarcane by itself is just not going to last very long. Unlike the Spanish system of forced native labor, Portuguese rely on the import of African slaves. This explains why Brazil is very African. It doesn't help that the natives are continually evading Portuguese forces, especially into the Amazon rainforest. Large-scale importing of slaves begins in the 1580s. Working condition is absolutely horrific, with 5 to 10% dying annually, meaning that you have to keep importing slaves in order to sustain the population. Whereas in North America, where slavery was relatively, emphasis on the relatively, better than in Portugal, where the conditions in North America were just decent enough that slaves could live long enough to reproduce, whereas in Portuguese Brazil they just died kept dying so much that they didn't live long enough. According to some estimates, it took one human life to produce 1 ton of sugar. So this is a brutal, horrible business. Almost kind of, yeah. In North America, you have fur trading with intense competition and even warfare between indigenous peoples to provide furs to the French and the British. This leads to a decimation of the beaver population for a fashion fad. Can you think of any other fashion fads that have destroyed our environment? There's also intense competition between the Dutch, French, and the English. Excuse me, the Dutch were also involved in the fur trade. Yeah. You also had the introduction of European manufactured goods and liquor to the natives in exchange for furs. This, as you can imagine, will have an adverse effect on the Native American populations, because now they have alcohol and guns. Not a good combination. Ever wondered why alcoholism remains a serious problem among the Native American populations? Well, this basically starts it all. Also, the guns made for incredibly more destructive warfare. You had the development of cash crops, which were products developed for European markets, such as tobacco, rice, indigo, cotton. This increased the demand for indentured service and slave labor. As we can see, there's a massive surge in export of tobacco from Virginia from 1616 to 1638, starting from almost nothing to 300,000 pounds of tobacco. And this stuff isn't even good anyway. This is terrible for your health. African slaves arrived in Virginia for the first time in 1619, and this basically marks the beginning of our American slavery. They increasingly replaced European indentured laborers in the late 17th and early 18th centuries. However, they were less prominent in the North due to the weak nature of the cash crop industry, since the North isn't really a great area to grow cash crops with the weather and the geography. Slave trading, however, is still important part of the northern economy. For example, assisting the creation of Brown University. The North also got rich distilling slave-produced sugar and molasses to rum, as well as trading slaves. Franciscan, Dominican, and Jesuit missionaries also flocked to the Americas from the 16th century. They taught Christian doctrine and literacy, and they also often accumulated cultural knowledge to better communicate their message. This explains why we know at least something about the Aztecs and the Incas, because the missionaries would often write down what they saw. Due to conquest and plague, many natives and Spanish Americans concluded that their gods had abandoned them, so they converted to Catholicism. Yet it often retained elements of pagan religion, of the local pagan religions in Christian worship. An example of this would be the Lady of Guadalupe, who in Latin American Roman Catholicism, who was adopted for Latin American Catholicism because of the fact that she, especially in Mexico, because of the fact that she is a better representation of the people who live there. French and English missions were less effective than Spanish missions, as the Spaniards ruled the settled native populations more directly. Migration patterns in North America, however, made it more difficult to conduct missions, and English colonists having little interest in converting natives. In the Pacific, you have basically broadly similar experience to the American natives, just terrible. Portuguese mariners have long been involved in the region, but the Dutch sailors make the first recorded sighting of Australia in 1606. The Dutch East India surveys most of the coastal territory and conclude that it is of little value. However, British Captain James Cook lands at Botany Bay in 1778, and thus he found a useful place to settle. Convicts were shipped to Australia, outnumbering free settlers until 1830. Wait, hold on. These convicts are. This was when they made convicts shipped to Australia. This means that it was a British penal colony. The Manila Galleons are interested in quick trade routes, so they didn't really explore much of the Pacific. The islands of Guam and the Marianas are significant laying on the trade routes. Between the 1670s and the 1680s, the Spaniards took control of the islands, and leading to smallpox destroying their local population. James Cook visits Hawaii in 1778. He initially has good relationship with the Hawaiians, but of course this has spread venereal diseases, and this pisses off the natives, so he's not welcome. 17 to 79, where he's killed in a dispute over petty thefts. Alright. Thank you very much for listening.